And I've been chairing some of these sessions. As everyone here will know, this is part of the series of the Social Histories of Revolution, the long 1960s. This year we're marking 50 years since the dramatic year of 1968 with a new series of discussion meetings, which is this. This just follows on from a series last year on the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. The meetings have been focused on the revolutionary events that swept the world starting in the 1960s. The 1968 general strike in France, the 75 Portuguese Revolution, and the social movements that swept the United States and Europe, the revolts that shook the Middle East, Latin America, and other parts of the global South, the civil rights movement in Ireland, and all its attendant revolt, including the Iranian Revolution of 1979 as well. The sessions are opened by historians who've studied these movements or by people who have participated in them as militants. And at each meeting, there's a talk of about 30 minutes, and then an hour or so for discussion and questions. And we'd like to encourage everybody to participate as much as possible. Nothing is a silly question, nothing is a silly comment. So please, I hope that that's the kind of discussion we want. Our emphasis is on the social histories of these movements. That is, how they were experienced by the mass of working people who took part in them. We want to reach a deeper understanding of revolution as the active participation of millions of people in changing history. And we hope our discussions will provoke us all into thinking about what is revolution, which is where we started this series. What do we mean by revolution? This session will be opened by Lynne Segal. We're very glad to have her, who's been active in left and feminist politics and has written extensively on feminism and gender politics. She's a professor of psychology and gender studies at Birkbeck and is currently working on the politics of care. So, over to Lynne.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's good to be here. I assumed I was going to be the very last speaker in this 68 series because my argument will be that feminism is the true inheritor of 68, and so therefore, after discussing everything, you should come to me. But I see that you're going to circle around in time. You're going to try and travel a little, so you'll be going backwards and forwards, depending on when speakers are available. However, that's my argument, and a lot of what I have to say is in this book called Making Trouble, which is actually a political memoir. My editor for that is sitting here, as it so happens, and it begins, this is not a memoir, but actually it is a sort of political memoir. And the second chapter is on my Sydney 60s, because I was in Sydney in the 60s, which does give me a special place, because I was a long way from the centre of action. And not only was I in Sydney, and hence a long way away from the site of those hurling paving stones in Paris, looking for the beach underneath, and doing other disobedient things, but also I was pregnant. I could be disobedient, actually, that's why I was pregnant. It was unexpected and unintentional, which often happened to women back in the 1960s, when all sorts of things were not so freely available as they are now. And I was at university, and I was studying, and what I was doing actually was writing a critique of mainstream psychology, which at the time spent all its time running rats in mazes and pretending that they were learning something about human behaviour from that very strange activity. So I was very much at odds with the department and didn't have a supervisor. It was marked outside of Australia, but sure enough I did get my licence to teach in higher education, but thereby was at the same time made unemployable because all the universities in Sydney at that time were mainstream behaviouristic experimental psychology departments, and many of them still are, in fact. And so I was unemployable, and in the end had to leave Australia in order to get a job. And I had to get a job because before long I became a single mother, and I had to have a job. So I went off to where things looked like they might be easier and where Australians had often gone before. There used to be a route from Sydney to England, to Britain, which many people took. Nowadays they often don't. Australians tell me, oh, we're doing a European tour, but we're leaving Britain out. And I imagine in the future, once we're Little England, if we're Little England, then they'll be even more inclined to leave us out. But in those days, when you left Australia, where you went was to Britain. I'll come to other reasons why why it was the place for me to come. But I never wanted to leave Sydney, actually. I've never been a traveller, and I would have preferred to stay where I was and get a job, but that then wasn't possible. And also, I didn't know what job I might want, or what I wanted to do at all, because I had spent the 60s like I was a classic so-called child of the 60s, lurching between anarchist politics and counterculture, and as confused as women everywhere, especially women students, about how to connect being a woman with the talk of freedom in the air, free love, free lives, and so on. How were we going to work out how to live these free lives, especially when we were pregnant women, as a number of us were? How did this talk of freedom actually relate to us? So that's what we vaguely, very vaguely, wondered. We wondered it vaguely because we didn't yet have a language to try and express what our worries and discontent and sense of not fitting in to the radical cultures that people like me belong to was all about. We did read Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex. We did read Doris Lessing, who, although she says she was never a feminist and has always hated feminists, nevertheless was incredibly important for budding feminists, because what she was talking about was the woes of women. She was talking about how hard women's lives were, which is why, in order to be a writer, she actually left her children, left her marriage and left her children behind in order to come to England. So she knew that it wasn't at all easy, but interestingly, like I think a lot of those survivors then, you know, they think that women collectively demanding changes and getting those changes have sort of, we're softer material than these ones were who could tough it out as single radical women before women's liberation. And what the sorts of culture that was around us, what everybody was reading in that decade of the 60s, was certainly very inauspicious for women, whether it was Henry Miller, Norman Mailer, all the angry young men. They're the people that all the guys we knew were reading, all those angry men, angry above all with whom? Well, it seemed not quite so much with the system, but with mothers and with wives and with all the strictures of domesticity, which they feared would interfere with their masculinity and their own wildness and emasculate them. And you only have to think of John Osborne or John Wayne or Kingsley Amis, and that would be very clear. So we couldn't really identify with much of the radical culture of the 1960s. And then also, it's true enough that culture, the whole iconography and image of the radical moment of the 1960s, whether it was the left underground papers or whether it was all the lurid pin-ups and things that were floating around us, often in magazines some people worked on in the underground press, and they would be looking at these images. I knew many women like Marcia Rowe, who started Spare Rib, who worked at Oz, and you can see there some of the typical images of the liberated woman who was free to let as many men as possible fuck her basically. And of course that was like, was that what we identified? Were these images there for us? You know, it didn't feel quite right, those, the relentless sexism of the decade, with all the tits and bums and so on there, supposedly to outrage the prudish, which it did. You know, there was a case brought against Oz for that school kids issue, and indeed they were sent to jail briefly, and they got out fairly soon, but they did have to cut all their long hair off, which must have been very distressing, I think. So it was designed to outrage the prudish, but and it was not designed, as the men would see it, to demean women. Although obviously it did do that as well. Obviously it did do that. So that's why these women who were involved in this politics and working on these journals would soon, as we'll see, begin to think, what's going on here? What's going on here? And yet, what I now know, you know, what I believe, as I said, as I began the talk, and why I should end all the talks on the 1968 and the 1960s, is that it is clear to me that the 60s was, and its legacies remain, absolutely critical for women's renaissance and the renewal of feminist politics. Especially, of course, that insistence on the connection between the personal and the political. The personal is political, politics is personal. There are seats down the front if people want to come up.
A couple of seats here, if anybody
So I'm going to go into some of the reasons why I argue this, that the 60s was critical for the rebirth of feminism. But I want to make two other points that I'll be illustrating in this talk. And the first thing is how distant we are now from the structures of feeling of 50 years ago, when the underground press and the counterculture and the anti-Vietnam movement and radical politics, which you will have been hearing about, was flourishing. We're so distant from that time when women are about to re-enter history. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, I think, time travelling across those years, is that it's interesting to note just how little of the future those busy trying to transform it managed to predict. Now, I'm not sure if that's good or bad for us now. In some ways it might be good that those who think they know what's going to happen often don't know. Neither activists nor radical thinkers, even the most theoretical, however reflective then, were really able to anticipate quite how or when change happens. Indeed, the change that was sort of happening on their doorstep, they somehow managed actually not to see it. And perhaps it was ever so and ever will be, and that's the absurdity of any form of political dogmatism or political certainties that some political groups have had, which Simon, you could tell us all about, where they think that they know exactly their role in making history and how history will unfold. So let me take you back just for a moment to what might seem in Britain the apotheosis of the 1960s, because we didn't have a street fighting 68, but we did have this amazing event called the Dialectics of Liberation that was in the Roundhouse in Camden, in London, and people came from far and wide. Stokely Carmichael, across Europe, obviously Tariq and our own radicals were, Tariq Ali and our own radicals were all there, but all the big Marxist thinkers, all the big thinkers were there. because this was a conference that lasted for 2 weeks. So you can imagine how many talks there were. Look at all those names there. You might note it, yes, you might see now, Ernest Mandel, Paul Sweezy, Lucien Goldman, Herbert Marcuse, David Cooper, and so on. I don't know if you can read them all, but the big names of that moment, the big thinkers and predictors of revolutionary change, are all on the platform during those 2 weeks, or so it's thought. You know, these are the movers and shakers of history. And it was actually put on by a movement which was very big in those times, anti-psychiatry. So it was Joe Burke and Ronnie Lang, who were the main people in charge of this event. And Lang, of course, was leading, almost, the main left guru of the day. Everybody read Lang. I mean, I don't know anybody who didn't read The Divide Itself, his book that came out in '59, and then Sanity Madness, and The Family, which came out in '63. We all read it, we all discussed it, and indeed it was what brought many people into the left, reading these anti-psychiatry texts. And Lang was the opening speaker, of course, and he gave he said what the conference was all about was demystifying human violence in all its forms. And the really interesting thing is, this opening talk is called The Obvious, What We All Know. Well, there was one little thing that they didn't notice, that they were all men. The audience was half women. It wasn't just half women either. In the audience was Angela Davis, Juliet Mitchell, Sheila Rowbottom, Sally Alexander. The audience was full of people who, in just like a few months, were going to be incredibly significant. But there wasn't a whisper of that in the 2 weeks of that conference. There was one incredibly brave woman on stage. She's not listed there. And when you read about the Dialectics of Liberation conference, you won't read about her. She was called Carolee Schneemann, and she was a performance artist. She went on to do amazing work about women's bodies and how women's bodies are demeaned and so on, and the fear and degradation that women exposing their flesh received. So of course she exposes her flesh on stage with other people there, and she is booed and hissed. She didn't actually get attacked on that platform, although over in Paris the following year she did get attacked on stage for daring to perform. And her performance would call things like meat, how women are treated, how women's bodies are just treated as flesh. So that was well illustrated by the response. But no one noticed, no one had a language to say, hang on a minute, that's a bit odd. And I hear that Juliet Mitchell walked out. Sheila, my friend Sheila Rowbottom, didn't walk out, but she said sitting through it was like a nightmare. It was like a 2-week nightmare, she said, listening to all these men on stage, Stokely Carmichael and everybody, they would all swagger onto stage and talk about the revolution. And this was after, actually, Juliet Mitchell had already published her article, Women, the Longest Revolution, in New Left Review. So why on earth wasn't she on the platform? But it was still going to be the longest revolution. They still hadn't noticed yet that might be happening. So, yes, a few years later, Sheila Rowbottom would write about that fortnight as being like a 2-week trauma. And she said she felt a severe sense of dislocation throughout. And yet, as she further reflected, as she sat there listening and also seeing other black women and other people sitting silently, listening, like Angela Davis, for instance. This is 1967, so Davis hasn't got arrested yet. She said she began to think that listening to Stokely and others and seeing black women sitting silently in the audience, she began to think the idea of taking hold of your own definition of freedom stuck, and started her thinking that just as Marxism had made sense of class as something you could describe historically, women needed to think about their own historical situation. They needed to educate themselves in line with the new emphasis on culture and consciousness. So, of course, she very soon, the next year, began writing Women in Revolution, and Women's Consciousness, Man's World. It sets off a whole chain of books from her trying to do just that, trying to think, what is women's role in history, but in particular, what is women's role in revolution? What is women's role in radical thinking? So, what you could say about Lang and most of his comrades that day is that they were themselves blind to what soon, in fact, was absolutely the obvious, that the spirit of the 60s was in every sense the cradle of feminism, and 1968 in particular. So I'm going to say something about 1968 in particular. 1967 was also when the Beatles wrote the song that gave me my title, She's Leaving Home. Because indeed, women were leaving home then. We were leaving home and we were having sex before marriage, and we were determined to escape that patriarchal grip of our fathers and to race around with all the bad boys and enjoy all the bad things, if we were straight. Not everyone was, but many were, of those days. However, women had problems trying to do that, trying to escape that paternalistic or patriarchal hold. But I do want to emphasize that women's liberation, when it emerges, is not merely a reaction against the male priorities of the previous decade, which, as we saw, seemed to be getting women naked and playing around with them. It also did come out of some of the ideas of the 1960s, and in particular, it's hard to see, is it, the ideas of the New Left, which had started in '58 with people like Stuart Hall and E.P. Thompson, and, well, you'll know all those New Left thinkers. Because it, as it didn't just emerge as a reaction, because what we took from that earlier decade that many of us had been, like me, had been around in, was, first of all, that there was something wrong with capitalism. We needed to denounce capitalist alienation. Alienation was a very big word then. Of course, Marcuse was very big in talking about alienation. We needed to and wanted to denounce consumerism, which is very interesting, isn't it? Because that's certainly what we need to be denouncing again now, which seemed to disappear briefly. Even amongst some feminists, we want to denounce consumerism. Above all, we wanted to denounce imperialism and join with others supporting anti-colonial struggles and trying to end the Vietnam War. They were the sorts of things that women with men in the 1960s were very much wanting to do, as we began slowly to get our own dreams of what else we might want. So what happened then in 1968 was that some of the women inside those left groups tried to get their voices heard. It wasn't easy. So, for instance, in Germany, Helke Sander and other women members of the German socialist student organisation, the SDS, had formed a group called Action Council for the Liberation of Women. And they came up with a very good idea, which was to convert empty shops into childcare centres. Imagine all the childcare centres we could have right now if we did that. And all the unemployed and underemployed people could get involved in childcare and various other things we might do in those empty shops. However, the men simply ignored this demand, which led Helke Sanders and her friends to unfurl this huge banner, "Liberate socialist eminences from their bourgeois cocks." And this was quite frightening and quite an aggressive act because it was illustrated. So yeah, it made an impact there. They would have done better, wouldn't they, to listen to converting shops into childcare centres. And that sort of revolt, it seems to me, you can hear echoing down through time. There would be more and more attention paid, of course, to what men did with their cocks and to issues of rape and so on, you know, rumbling all the way down to Me Too today. The sorts of determination to try and stop not just sexism but the coerciveness that sometimes goes along with male sexuality. And soon too it wouldn't be all those men who were on the platform with Stokely Carmichael and Ronnie Lang and so on, but many other women beginning to unfurl banners and make their mark. So 68 was also the year in which various women in the SDS in the States would also call on their men to unite with them, usually in vain and usually being heckled if they took to the platform. "Women of the world unite, we have nothing to lose but our men," was a banner that was unfurled on one of the SDS platforms in the States. 68 was also the year when women's I forgot what it's called. I'll come back to it. It was also when Angela Davis starts to come to the fore, when Angela Davis is arrested, and there's a huge campaign to free Angela Davis and indeed to free other black women in prison, led by the women in the Black Panther Party, which I believe you're soon going to hear something about in one of the future meetings, with women in the nascent women's movement also supporting their black sisters. This is of course a time when Joan Baez is the leading folk singer of the decade, and for a while she was with Bob Dylan, who doesn't stay around of course but leaves her, and also doesn't stay political either much after the 60s, and so she sings her song, "You left us marching on the road and said how heavy was the load. The years were young, the struggle barely had its start." I can hear her singing this, I don't know if any of you can. "But we're still marching in the streets with little victories and big defeats, and there is joy and there is hope, and there's a place for you." So you see, the women are beginning to find their voice, just as so many men. I don't think they're losing their voice, but they're certainly no longer jumping on platforms and you know, out in the street in the same way as women soon will be. Over here, it's because my computer's so far from me I can hardly read it. Over here, Sheila Rowbottom, who I've already mentioned, was the sole woman on Black Dwarf, the magazine edited by Tariq Ali, and she used to go around trying to sell it. And she describes going to a radical students' conference in Essex, trying to sell the paper. So someone's smiling, so I think they might have been there, and taking to the platform to talk about the underfunding of further education where she's teaching. And she just gets heckled and wolf whistled by all those leading radicals in the audience, but she says she just gritted her teeth and kept on talking about the underfunding of further education, although it did lead her to leave Black Dwarf the following year, but not before she had she had been responsible for an issue on women's liberation in 1969. She wasn't allowed to be in charge of it, being a woman, but she did interview all sorts of other women, the women on strike at Ford's in Liverpool, and the fishermen's wives who were supporting their men who were in struggle at the time. And so she said this must have been one of the few times in which a prediction that was made in one of these left papers that this is the time of women was actually true. This was actually going to be the time of women. So 68 was also the year that in the US was the first widely reported protest, which was the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City. And 2 years later, we would over here demonstrate against why Miss World, and I know at least one person is here from who was there that day, where they so freaked out Bob Hope, who was orchestrating what he referred to as a cattle market. And then, he's so outraged, he actually wants to get off stage and run away and say, I prefer to be in Vietnam than here. But somehow he's made to stay around as all the women get arrested and hustled off stage. It was also the year that budding feminist poet, she was already a poet, but she was going to really shine as a feminist poet. Adrienne Rich wrote her poem Planetarium, where she said, a woman in the shape of a monster in the shape of a woman, the skies are full of them. And suddenly it's true, it was raining women. Because today, as you know, they sing about it raining men, but it was raining women then. Women of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your men, was that banner I said. They're also unfurled in 1968. So unite for a while, women tried to do, continuing many of those old battles which they had been involved in with the men active in the 1960s. Although when you read about the 1960s, you often, you don't usually read that, what was happening to women and what women were doing in 1968. It's quite unusual to see it, which is why I'm here today to tell you about it. Thus then, by the 1970s, everything was changing, though rarely, as I've said, quite as predicted. The 60s emphasis on culture and personal identity fed the exuberant rise of movement politics. Yeah. I see Angela Davis, and that was the importance of us just having to invent the words, to find the words, to talk about what women want. 5 minutes, my God, I see I'm a third of the way through. Okay, I've got pictures I can race through soon. So we first of all try to find the words to talk about our bodies, to find words that aren't insults about our bodies. You know all the insulting words for the slang and the cunt and so on. But we have to try and begin again to think about how we can talk about ourselves without shame, without embarrassment. And so cultural politics was very important, and also the role of cross-class alliances, but very much stressing solidarity with the most oppressed, which was, I was, for instance, involved in groups supporting women in prison, women who were signing on, the Claimants Union, all these. We began by thinking, you know, who are the women who most need our solidarity, and trying to express solidarity with those women. And these were, of course, the time in which we were engaged, in particular, in radical local politics, in trying to make women's lives better, children's lives better, and women's and men's lives better, trying to change our community. So they were the years of trying to unionize women workers. I can remember going with many other people trying to unionize nursery workers, trying to unionize women cleaners, a struggle which is still going on today in these very campuses. It was one of the first big struggles of women's liberation, the night cleaners campaign, working together with May Hobbs, who was a night cleaner. There were housing struggles, successful housing struggles. So demanding, fighting for, expanding community resources of all sorts, and creating those resources ourselves, law centres, housing advice centres, squatting advice centres, setting up our own nurseries and playgroups, battered women's centres. All those things were what we were up to, as well as, of course, trying to transform the misogynist climate of sexism all around us. You see, if it were a lady, it would get its bottom pinched. If this lady was a car, she'd run you down. And you would see that, or something like that, around London and elsewhere, very much out of London as well. Sisters question every aspect of our lives. So this is me at a very local protest for the pin-ups in Islington Gazette. Women of Islington Unite. I see I'm smoking, though I never smoke, as my doctor knows, but somehow someone stuck a cigarette to the back. So, you know, it was a time of amazing political activity led by women, with a lot of successes. And it was organising with women as an identity politics, but it also was very much always a collective process and a looking across to unite with other women. So what happens now? I'll just go through the slides then, since you want me to finish up. Well, what happens is that many things are changing. By the end of the 70s, of course, capitalism's in crisis, the right is growing. In 79, Thatcher is going to be elected, and that emphasis on personal life and individual struggle, although feminism was never simply about personal life and individual struggle, and needed to be able to say something about how women could reclaim and talk about their bodies and so on, but we needed to change what we were going to do to stay radical, and that's why Adrian Rich is very much of women born and very much stressing the role of the body. Comes to think, we've really got to engage in more. We've got to engage in a stronger anti-capitalist struggle. One period's necessary strategies can mutate into the monsters of another time. Oh yes, so they're the monsters of another time. And what's happening is that capitalism is, as it always does, mainstreams radical protests, and mainstreams the language of radical protest too. So it mainstreams women's empowerment, as though what we had been fighting for was our own individual empowerment. So someone like Margaret Thatcher said she hated feminism she couldn't stand feminism. Feminists can't stand me, she said quite rightly, because we wanted a collective struggle that was about improving the resources for everyone, whereas what she was doing was determined to smash the unions, start withdrawing money from local government, a practice that's gone on, which was the seedbed for a lot of local struggle, but in particular to change hearts and minds. So it was the individual, and individual success and individual empowerment that was all important, and the complete denigration and contempt for failure and for dependency to justify rolling back the state. That sort of mindset that she and the media was so pushing, which unfortunately New Labour, when it comes in, does very little to overturn the ideology. They did a little to overturn some of the rising inequality that the decades of Thatcherism had produced, but very little to overturn the ideology. And so today, you get women themselves, powerful individuals, like, for instance, Theresa May, happy to say, I am a feminist. And indeed, she started a group in the Tory party called Women into Power. So, you see, the idea that what feminists wanted was individual empowerment is an idea the market loves. And so that's why you can end up today with one form of feminism, which the media will be very happy to talk about and promote, which is, of course, the Sheryl Sandberg lean-in feminism, or all those others who say, oh, you women, you feminists, complaining all the time, what you should get on with is encouraging women to win, as though everyone could be winners in a class society, and indeed a racist and still sexist society which is becoming more and more and more unequal. So that's why, for many feminists, these became very depressing times. It's not just Adrienne Rich who said, we're going to have to change our strategies. Many other people from black feminism, like Gayatri Spivak, who spent much of the 90s saying we must be talking about the institutional sides of cultural change, not just identity politics, or Nancy Fraser, who again in the 1990s says we have to distinguish the politics of redistribution from the struggles for recognition. So those that have been demeaned and looked down on, as women have, as black people have, and largely still are, you know, as the disabled, as gays, lesbians, transsexuals and so on, have always been there, or the politics for recognition, important struggles. But a few people can rise to the top in those struggles. Obama can become president of America, and so on, while the situation of most black people is getting a lot worse. So you must also have a politics of redistribution. You must actually have something like a Marxist politics attentive to class. Nancy Fraser goes further, really, sort of blaming feminism for what happens, not a position I agree with, although there's a lot of feminists now writing and trying to analyse the way in which this type of neoliberal feminism is being pushed. So Catherine Rottenberg has written a book published just a few months ago on the rise of neoliberal feminism, and other people on that sort of populist feminism, which has nothing to do with collective struggle or attention to class struggle. So that's the depressing side that we have to work out how to deal with. Meanwhile, resistance is always waiting in the wings, and has been really spurred by the election of Trump, among many other things, by the heightened increase of austerity since 2008, when the rich have got dramatically richer, when the poor have got dramatically poorer. These are things it's a little hard to completely hide. And so, of course, that has meant resistance on many fronts over rising and falling at different times, in 2011 with the election of Trump and so on. So that movement politics Look what happened in Spain only last year. 5 million people, mainly women, 5 million women go on strike on International Women's Day. And that is pretty amazing. That's some form of resistance. Yeah, a lot of people say feminism is dead. Feminism sort of, 1 minute.
Sorry.
1 minute, oh yes. There we are. Yes, that's perfect. Resistance in there. Is the future female? Was the first book I ever wrote. And I said the answer was no, but hopefully women will be involved. So is the future feminist? That's what a lot of people are saying today. And this was Women's Day here last year. We believe in life after work. So this was a time, the women's strike, of many different actions happening. Women are still active, women are still struggling, but as I say, we're hardly speaking with just one voice.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you. There's lots and lots to think about. Can I just say before we go on to discussion, the organisers and contributors to these talks are volunteers for various movements to change society. This year we have a great range of contributors, and we've got a lot more meetings coming up, which Simon will tell us about later on. And we've got